Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Transportation and Environment Committee. We have a very full, too full agenda today, and was just telling council members, I think there was a little bit of confusion, and we want to pare it back a little bit. We only have at most 2 hours, a little less than 2 hours to go today, and BEPS will certainly take more than today, probably 3 or 4 work sessions. So I'm going to try and limit the BEPS discussion to like an hour and 15 minutes, and then get to the resolution on transportation fees, charges, and fares, and allow our guests from WMATA to brief us quickly on the Blue and Orange and Silver Line capacity study. The crowdsourcing system, I think we can wait on until a meeting that isn't so packed. So we can start in as soon as all of our guests are ready. Do any of my colleagues want to make any opening remarks? Okay. Who do we, Director Ortiz, Ms. Curley, Ms. Shaw, terrific, and Ms. McCartney-Green. Great. We're very, we know a lot about this bill. We've talked a lot about this bill, eager to jump in. Hey, Stan, good to see you as well. Ms. McCartney-Green, thank you for your work on this. Let me turn it over to you.
And I'll be brief, but thank you, Council President Hucker, and a good morning to Councilmember Reamer and Councilmember Glass. As you mentioned, this is a very comprehensive legislative bill concerning reforming Chapter 18A, which is our environmental sustainability. This bill was, public hearing was well attended. We had over 30 written testimonies that were provided from nonprofits and from the public. And with that, this obviously, the purpose of the bill is to address the county's climate action. And one of the technical areas were buildings. And so this bill does make a notation to go over beyond the current law, which is our current benchmarking law, which is in place for commercial buildings and for county-owned buildings. I am going to stop there so I can give the DEP team the opportunity to do a presentation going into the nuts and bolts. My staff report is structured more for a discussion, and so we'll continue today, and I guess Council President Hucker, you'll decide whether or not we can continue the discussion at a future date.
Yeah, we definitely will continue at probably more than one future date. So, Director Ortiz, thank you, Ms. McCartney-Green. Director Ortiz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate the time. Great to see everybody, and appreciate the staff work on this issue. I'll make some brief opening remarks, and we can get right into the presentation from Ms. Shaw, which I think will address some of the principal questions that were raised in the staff packet. But the first thing I want to say is that there's no meaningful chance for making progress on greenhouse gas emissions without BEPS. There's only a handful of things that the county has authority right out of the gate, and we have authority on building standards. The 25% emissions in the commercial sector is something that we can get our hands around. There are thousands of buildings in the commercial sector that we can begin to address with BEPS. In the residential sector, as we know, there are hundreds of thousands of homes. And in the transportation sector, we know that there are millions of vehicles. So this is a way that out of the gate, we can begin to craft policy and procedures and rules that make a difference on greenhouse gases. As many of you have heard, this is a trajectory approach. We've been very deliberate in the staff in doing our homework, speaking to other jurisdictions that have similar policies, and engaging stakeholders from activists to our friends at AOBA, at MBIA, at the Chambers of Commerce, and we've had robust conversations as recently as last week with them, and that will continue. So what we presented is very thoughtful. It's what we call a trajectory approach, is that we stick the landing in 2035. And we want to guide. Sometimes we might need to push, but we know we don't want to shove things that are unrealistic, because when we shove or when we aren't thoughtful, we have no chance of being successful in doing what we're setting out to do with this legislation. So we want to be clear and deliberate in making progress, and that's what this is about. So I want to talk a little bit briefly about what this is about, what this is not about. What's before the committee is giving us the authority to begin the rulemaking. This is to begin setting up the advisory groups to craft the specifics of the rules. So what are the targets exactly for the different classes of buildings within the time frames? That's very detailed work. It will differ from building type to building type, and that's not appropriate for this enabling legislation. That's something in the rulemaking. It's important to us that we get going as soon as possible to establish those advisory groups and get into the rulemaking. Also, it's come up, what kind of financial assistance is available. There's a handful, but we want to also be able to staff up and create a one-stop shop for making these improvements financially feasible for different actors. We want to make sure that people are able to access the resources that are around us in the government and the private and the public sectors to make progress. But we need the authority to be able to begin that work, to do it in earnest and to staff up. And finally, what this is not the specific rulemaking. We will be back with the rulemaking on the specific targets for the specific building types within the timelines, in the future. And that process will be a lot like this. As we know, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, there's public hearings, there's presentations like this, and then there's lots of stakeholder engagement that will go into the details. But I want to begin where I started, is with I'm just grateful that we're having this conversation. We've talked online and offline with many of you about these details, and we've said in meetings and presentations, often on the same panels about this. So you've heard a lot about this, but we're just so grateful to begin this work session and start getting into it. So with that, Mr. Chairman, if it's okay with you, I'd like to hand it off to Lindsay Shaw, who's our subject matter expert, who's really been in the trenches working with our stakeholders and coming up with our legislation.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and council members, for the opportunity to present today. I'd like to get into a presentation, so I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully that's visible. Excellent. So we're here this morning to talk about Bill 1621, which is the proposed building energy performance standards for Montgomery County. We're here to start off with a brief overview of the law and then get into some of the details that the staff report walks us through. So here's our proposed agenda for at least today. We'd like to give an overview of Bill 1621, what's in the bill, as well as get into some of the details on which buildings are covered and the performance metric that was proposed in this legislation. Mr. Chairman, we hear that there are multiple work sessions that are planned here. We think that that's a smart way to move forward. There's a number of other topics that we'll need to get into, including how to set the standards, how to show compliance, what tools and resources are available for building owners to meet BEPS, as well as a preview into what the regulations will look like, which Director Ortiz has given us a good snapshot into already. Before we get into that, I just want to walk through a couple highlights here. Bill 1621 was developed with stakeholder input. Our proposed approach here has a long-term performance standard based on energy use that's within the building owner's control, and it also gives those building owners certainty on what the target is out into the future and flexibility in meeting that target. The proposed law covers the largest buildings in Montgomery County and also the biggest carbon emitters. But one thing to note is that we already have a lot of high performance buildings in Montgomery County already. Not all buildings will be covered, and not all buildings will be required to take action under BEPS. We're going after the poorer performers, the ones that need a little bit of help. That's what BEPS will really cover. In the end, while we're going after carbon emissions, BEPS has a lot of co-benefits that we've talked about in a number of different settings, but here we're talking about buildings that will be more resilient. We'll have higher value buildings in Montgomery County with upgrades being done to these buildings, increased economic activity and local green jobs based right here in Montgomery County. And we're having the opportunity for better indoor air quality for tenants in those buildings, all while lowering our greenhouse gas emissions. There are tools and resources available right now. Building owners can pick up the phone and call the Montgomery County Green Bank to access a number of different financing products. There's the brand new energy efficiency building tax credit that was recently had some amendments come forward and pass through council, so we can open up that program. Excited about that. And then we've had utility incentives available to building owners since 2008. And the state has very generous grant opportunities through the Maryland Energy Administration as well. But we know that BEPS is not an easy lift for some building owners. Those building owners will need additional technical and financial assistance, especially affordable housing. We want to make sure that this bill doesn't have unintended consequences. We want to make sure that we insulate against that and make sure that affordable housing operates as efficiently as market rate housing, and that the building owners that own those properties have what they need to comply. By passing Bill 1621, Montgomery County will become the first county to join a group of leading edge jurisdictions that have used BEPS to tackle climate change impacts from buildings. That includes New York City, Washington, D.C., our neighbors to the south, St. Louis, Missouri, and Colorado and Washington, and a couple other jurisdictions that are exploring beyond benchmarking policies. So why BEPS? What are we talking about with building energy performance standards? This council earlier passed climate emergency declaration in December of 2017. Heard that. It's something that we need to accelerate our climate goals. So we have our eyes on the prize here for an 80% reduction by 2027 and 100% elimination of greenhouse gas emissions by 2035. So as mentioned in the climate plan, building energy performance standards, it's a policy that sets a minimum energy performance threshold for existing buildings. So new buildings, when we're talking about new or existing buildings that are doing major retrofits, that's covered by our building code. And we have the 2018 International Green Construction Code that was recently passed, as well as the ability to have local authority over energy and other codes so that we can use those building codes to our advantage through trying to achieve our climate action plan goals. But unless a building needs to do those upgrades or has some other purpose of reaching out to the county, existing buildings don't have to improve their energy performance. And when we're talking about our aggressive climate goals, that creates a challenge for us. So BEPS is one of those powerful policy tools to address emissions from the existing commercial and multifamily buildings in Montgomery County. We want to ask them to improve their energy performance through energy efficiency measures. You're looking at the pie chart on the right-hand side. That's a snapshot of our 2018 greenhouse gas emissions inventory in Montgomery County. You'll see that 50% of our emissions is from the built environment, split pretty evenly between residential buildings and commercial buildings. One thing to note, BEPS would cover multifamily properties as well. That appears a little bit in the residential pie chart here and a little bit in commercial. Multifamily doesn't fit in a nice box like these two because they're metered differently. Some buildings have individual metering for each individual tenant. Some are master metered. So based on their metering structure, they may appear in the blue wedge, may appear in the orange wedge, just something to note moving forward. So,
and Michelle, it would be, I heard you say that yesterday too. That's interesting in how you're counting them. It would be helpful to pull out that sector and let us know how much of each cohort that they represent.
That would be a great thing. We'll look into that. We have had some challenges just based on how our GHG emissions inventory is put together. It is hard to identify that wedge, but we can follow up with the Council of Governments and see if that's something that's possible.
Okay, Councilmember Reamer had a question.
Thanks so much. Well, I just wanted to observe here, I think that the viewer could get confused about what BEPS is going to actually achieve. BEPS is not going to eliminate emissions from the building sector. It is going to make buildings more efficient, but they're still going to use a huge amount of energy. The only way to actually eliminate building emissions from the energy sector is both making buildings more efficient so they use less energy while switching the fuel that they do use to clean energy. And office buildings, unless somehow we're driving towards geothermal, which isn't, I'm sure, enough anyway. I mean, it's an exemplary building like the United Therapeutics that can actually be I don't even know if that is even net zero.
It is.
But what we're really talking about is making buildings more efficient. The way to get to zero emissions or to significantly reduce emissions from the building sector, residential and commercial, is to combine efficiency with getting the electricity grid cleaned up off of coal and gas. So I do want to take a little bit of an issue with the comment at the beginning that this is one of the only things that we can do. We can have a big impact on greening the grid. on getting the county off of fossil fuels in the electricity grid so that when you flip the lights on or run the air in a very efficient building, you're pulling from solar and wind power, especially solar, So I just want to keep that in perspective, that I think there's a little bit of a mythology that BEPS will actually eliminate this sector's emissions. It makes an important, if incremental, improvement in this sector's emissions, but the sector will still have a huge amount of emissions unless we actually green the grid, clean up the grid itself. And that's where, portfolio standards at the state level and solar at the county level comes into play. If I'm incorrect in any of that, I certainly invite a response, but I'm a little concerned that we're creating a misunderstanding out there that through BEPS, we can clean up this sector. We can make this sector more efficient, which we must do in order to have an overall clean electrification. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I can just briefly respond. And Mr. Reamer, there's no disagreement from me or anybody here on that. We believe that there's a critical path to getting to zero emissions, and part of that critical path is more efficient buildings.
Right.
So this is not a silver bullet by any stretch, but we need to.
Yeah. And I know you're not thinking I know that you know. I think the question is, does our community, because we're all grappling with how to understand this path. How do we get on this path to massively reducing and then eliminating our emissions? And I think the overall point that keeps coming home for me is that making buildings more efficient, reducing the amount that people drive, those things are crucial, but those are marginal relative to getting buildings off of dirty fuel 100% thanks to a clean grid, and getting vehicles off of dirty fuel 100% thanks to electric vehicles and a clean grid. Like 80% of our emissions really comes from the fuel switch. And I think the Climate Action Plan's big report bears that out. It's really the fuel switch but you have to have the efficiency in order to make it possible. So these things are tied together. Thank you.
Great point. Thank you.
They are. And Director Ortiz, you mentioned at the beginning, this is, building emissions is one thing the county has control over, unlike, say, the fuel mix that's allowed at the state level and regulated at the Public Service Commission. We also have an enormous amount of control over land use. And while we need more efficient buildings made with better materials and using less carbon, and we need to better them heated and cooled by and lit by a better fuel mix, we also need the right kinds of buildings in the right places. And that was left out of the Climate Action Plan, unfortunately. But that's a really big driver of our emissions as well, is our land use decision. So we won't cover everything today, but we need the right buildings in the right places, not just more efficient buildings as well.
Yeah, we all agree in principle with that, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. Point taken, absolutely. Also, it's worth noting, since folks are listening, and Councilman Reamer's point is spot on. Folks, and many of them are listening, helped pass community choice energy at the state level. We gave the county, Montgomery County, which we welcomed, enabling legislation to help green our grid. So that's a big deal as well. So these two policies really are on the forefront and working together. To your point, Mr. Reamer, we have a shot of getting there. But thank you, gentlemen. Points taken.
And it actually summed up the last 2 points on this slide. So I appreciate that. So by reducing the demand on the grid, by our buildings using energy more efficiently, we're actually able to right-size the amount of carbon-free energy that's needed to be supplied by the grid. So it actually brings down what is needed in terms of meeting our RPS and adding new renewables to the grid. And by swapping out fossil fuel-based systems with electrified systems, we're also able to bring in that clean energy source from the grid as opposed to using fossil fuel-based systems. So we're actually able to get closer to that carbon neutrality goal, which is we know our buildings are still going to use energy, but we want to make sure that if they are using energy, they're using it from clean sources. So that's why moving towards electrified systems really is key in our climate action plan and in strategy in our BEPS as well.
Well, I'm sorry, but how is, to Mr. Reamer's point, how is that part of BEPS? BEPS doesn't
We'll
speak
get
to...
there. We're
Okay.
going to talk about the metric and how that all ties in together. So can I get to that point?
Go ahead, sure.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the framework of Bill 1621. And I believe it was mentioned earlier today, this builds on the foundation that we've set back in May of 2014 with the Building Energy Benchmarking Law. We're able to do BEPS now because we had that law in place, and we have a number of buildings that are already benchmarking. They already have a handle on their energy use trends. They're reporting that data to the county annually. Emily Curley on the line puts together a really nice benchmarking report that summarizes the trends. So if anyone hasn't looked at the 2020 report yet, take a look at that. It's really nice. Might be coming soon, but it actually shows some of the impact of COVID on the commercial buildings in Montgomery County. It's a really interesting look. So we're able to even look at BEPS as a possibility because we have that benchmarking law in place. This does create the framework to establish a performance standard that's similar to other jurisdictions that have done BEPS and passed laws for BEPS, even during 2020, that we are looking at setting numerical standards to be defined by regulation following the passage of Bill 1620. So, but Bill 1620, it has a lot of meat on the bones. We have the structure of the standard, the timeline, the buildings that are covered, the metric that's used, and considerations for under-resourced sectors like affordable housing mentioned in that bill so that we can come back with more fine-tuned regulations to address some of those concerns. Of course, similar to the majority of policies that we roll out in DEP, we start with stakeholders first. We talk to our stakeholders early and often. The link here goes to a policy recommendations report that was put together by our stakeholders with advisement from the Institute for Market Transformation. Those stakeholders were represented by commercial and multifamily building communities and the groups that serve them, including our advocacy groups, utilities, energy contractors, and county government and local jurisdiction representatives. So we've got a really good amount of feedback from those stakeholders. The majority, if not all of those suggestions were put into Bill 1621. But the key takeaway from working with our stakeholders and putting together Bill 1621 is that we need to balance flexibility and certainty for building owners with immediate climate action. So we think that Bill 1621 really strikes the balance there. So our approach here was actually to amend the existing benchmarking law. We're both dropping the square footage threshold down, bringing in newly covered buildings, adding in that performance requirement, and then of course establishing an advisory board similar to other jurisdictions to advise the county on implementation of BEPS. Director Ortiz mentioned the trajectory approach earlier. I think that this slide is not new to council members here, but might be news to the public. So I want to talk through this a little bit of what this means. So DEP worked with our stakeholders and the Institute for Market Transformation. We received free technical support in late 2019 through early 2021 on developing our policy. So we had experts at the table helping us craft this legislation. We developed this long-range trajectory approach in collaboration with those stakeholders. This Montgomery County grown BEPS strategy is now in the Institute for Market Transformation's model ordinance language. So other jurisdictions looking to adopt a BEPS policy look at that model ordinance and say, wow, this is a pretty good approach. It balances flexibility with immediate action that my climate plan goals locally are trying to achieve. Each covered building will receive a custom baseline based on their historical average energy use, taking higher years in that average so that if we have an off year, that's not included in the baseline for those buildings. Buildings within the same property type grouping will be working towards the same final standard that's 12 to 15 years out into the future. Data will still be reported annually through the Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool, which is a free online tool that many building owners in the county are already using if they're not reporting to DEP already. It's a pretty commonplace tool that's supported by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. and is really one of the tools that building owners use to communicate their energy use, track trends over time, and apply for that Energy Star to set them apart from other buildings in their peer group. Every 4 years, buildings will be evaluated based on that benchmarking data to determine whether or not they're meeting interim targets, which will be defined by regulation. We're also exploring what a credit for on-site solar might look like in this BEPS model to incentivize additional on-site solar generation. So we're feeding more clean energy into our grid. We have more solar here. We realize that the solar renewable energy certificate market in Maryland is not as strong as it could be, especially compared to our Washington, D.C. neighbors. So this is just another tool in our tool belt to help expand renewable energy in Montgomery County. So looking at this trajectory model, it's got that long-term standard out into the future. It's got certainty for building owners to say, I know where I need to go. But then there's flexibility in how they manage their buildings. This is a performance standard. We're not creating a prescriptive compliance pathway that's really burdensome for building owners or burdensome for county staff. We're saying, you know your building's best. Improve your energy performance, get to this final standard. And we think that overall, this long-range approach helps balance, again, what we're asking building owners to do with what the county wants to do with meeting its climate goals. But also, this long-range approach helps overcome short-term economic shocks, and it provides us ample time to communicate with building owners, bring them on board, educate the impacted community, and help them with compliance so that we are getting compliance first and reducing our emissions. That's the whole goal of this policy. But we realize that not all buildings operate in this very smooth, straight line going down towards a target. In this slide here, the blue line is the target for a building, but building A performance might be more accurately depicted through this kind of bumpy orange line. You might have buildings that say, I've done everything I can, but I can't control how my tenants use energy. Or I've done everything I can, but I have a really big recapitalization cycle coming up. It's within the time frame of the final performance standard. I'm going to get to that performance standard. Here's how I'm going to do it. I'm just not going to make this first interim standard. Building owners that can't meet that standard mark can file a building performance improvement plan. That's saying that owners that are carrying out the actions and following that timeline in their approved building performance improvement plan will be considered in compliance. So they're not meeting their standard. They're trying. They're doing what they can. They have a plan to get to the final standard. The fact that they are working towards that means that they would be considered in compliance. And we think the beauty of this is that you have two compliance pathways. One is performance-based, one is this building performance improvement plan. It really avoids an administratively burdensome prescriptive approach. We heard that loud and clear from our stakeholders when we first met. Don't make this prescriptive. I know my buildings better than the county does, and we agree with that. We think that this attempt to kind of put a blanket set of measures out there for, frankly, we have a lot of variety in our building stock in Montgomery County. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. So we think that a building performance improvement plan is a strategy that works well for building owners. It gives us the information of how they're going to meet the target that works best for them. There's also a couple other benefits to not using a prescriptive approach. We realize that some building owners might be receiving Empower Maryland incentives for certain prescriptive measures. We didn't want to necessarily take away legislated prescriptive requirements to say, you have to do this one measure. Everyone needs to do a lighting upgrade, or everyone needs to do something that's currently getting incentives through the Empower Maryland program, which is a ratepayer-funded, utility-operated energy efficiency program. We want to make sure that building owners have access to all those resources for incentives, so that we didn't want to necessarily say, hey, everyone needs to do a retro commissioning audit, and therefore that incentive program is no longer available to all Montgomery County building owners just because the covered ones need to do that. So that it was just a policy choice that we said, if we avoid the prescriptive pathway, we think that this will be the right way forward. We realized that the idea of a prescriptive pathway might be really great for some building owners that say, just tell me what you want me to do and I'll do it. We hear that, and that's where we think this one-stop shop model that Director Ortiz mentioned earlier is really where we need to be. The buildings in Montgomery County have such a variety of needs and use types and tenant requirements. We want to make sure that we give them the resources they need for their building and not necessarily trying to make everyone fit into a box. So this is just the second compliance pathway here. We think that limiting it is the right way to go. Again, it provides flexibility that we're able to meet building owners where they are in terms of the performance of their building and help them improve as best they can. I mentioned very early on that there's flexibility and compliance strategies. Not all buildings are going to need to do something. And so I want to walk through this slide because I feel like that's a really important message for BEPS here. Starting from the bottom up, the green line at the bottom, this building owner is already below the target. They don't need to necessarily do anything. They just need to maintain their current good performance. The yellow line here is a building that is close to meeting the target. They might find operations and maintenance efficiencies or low and no cost retrofit opportunities to get to the target, but they don't need to take multi-million-dollar retrofit undertakings to really get to that final standard. There are the two buildings here. The blue line is the blue line that you've seen on other charts. That building will need some investment. There's probably a lot of low-hanging fruit in that building considering how far they are away from the target. But there is capital available, there are programs available, and in the end, the owner is going to get the long-term benefit of a higher performing building. The purple line at the top is what fits into the building performance improvement model. This building is not meeting the target. They're not even close. It's not going to happen. But they're going to need investments. They might not be able to do everything that would get them to the target, but we want to make sure that they at least have some sort of reduction. So that's when they would file a building performance improvement plan and say, here's what I'm able to do. Here's what I can reasonably undertake, and I commit to doing that before the final standard. So the big takeaway here, not all buildings will need to undertake significant retrofit projects to meet the building energy performance standards.
Mr. Chair, just real quick, would we like Ms. Shaw to conclude, to finish her presentation and jump back?
How much longer do you have, Ms. Shaw?
I have a final timeline slide here, and then we wanted to start talking about which buildings would have to comply, and then why Mr. Chairman, to answer your earlier question about why the metric that we've selected accomplishes.
Right.
Yep. So we can take a break. I would like to talk through the timeline, and then we can we have kind of a divider slide where we can maybe take some questions and then hopefully get back into it. But
that's fine. Why don't you go through the timeline, and then we'll see what's on the minds of our committee members.
Okay, that sounds great. So this is just a very high-level snapshot about the timeline that is currently in Bill 1621. Newly covered buildings are in Group 3. Buildings that previously didn't have to benchmark and now do have to benchmark based on changes in the building coverage here, dropping that square footage threshold down of commercial non-residential buildings. They would be benchmarking their calendar year 2021 data as the bill's currently written, which we realize it's the end of October. That may need to change. And that those buildings would need to report by June 1st of 2022. It's kind of a short time frame to reach out to those building owners, but it can be done. Other jurisdictions have done it in a faster turnaround time. But the big takeaway here is that newly covered buildings would have 3 years of benchmarking before we would create their baseline, and then they would be entered into the performance standard pathway. Buildings would continue to report annually on June 1st every year. And as we're moving forward, every 4 years, we would be checking to see if they are on track to meet their final standard by checking their interim progress. So up in the top left corner here, hoping the legislation was going to be passed in 2021, fingers crossed, but if not, well, this can all bump out a little bit. We are in the process of undertaking technical analyses to help inform regulations. Once Bill 1621 is passed, we can start putting the advisory board together. There are parameters in the law of a 15-member advisory board with certain representatives put on that board to help, again, inform the regulations that are put forward. 2022, we'd issue the regulations. We'd start communicating with the building owners who are already benchmarking to let them know what their baselines are and what they'll need to work for their interim and final standards. All this to say, the big takeaway here is that this is a long-range standard. We're giving building owners, again, that certainty out into 2035, 2036, and 2037 to say, you're operating your buildings this way now, but we want you to start thinking about how to operate your buildings more efficiently moving forward. So if you do have a capital replacement that you need to do, your boilers fail, you need to upgrade your systems in the building in 2030, that you're making sure that the energy efficient choice, the one that's going to help you meet BEPS, is the one that you make. So with that, we'd like to talk about building coverage next, but I'm happy to stop sharing my screen so we can take questions, or if you want to flip around the slides, we can do that too, if you want to go back to something. But I appreciate the opportunity to get through that first section.
Okay. Councilmember Glass?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I'll try to keep it relevant to the slides that you've already shared, and appreciate all the work that has gone into this. Lots of stakeholder conversations I know that you all have done, and many of those same individuals and organizations have reached out to me, and we've had some good conversations. And I think everyone, clearly recognizes that we need to do something different. We're in a climate crisis, and nearly little less than half of the greenhouse gas emissions in Montgomery County come from our physical infrastructure and our buildings, and so we have to tackle this in order to tackle the climate crisis. And so I'm just looking at some of the notes that I had taken when I had chimed in specifically regarding that one chart. I think that was called flexibility in compliance strategies with the 4. Yep. So thank you for that. Mm-hmm. So all of that particular slide makes sense as to how the different buildings and their owners would need to mitigate and conform to the bill. Do you know the breakdown in all the different buildings that we have and where they fall within those 4 different categories?
So that's some of the work that we're undertaking with Stephen Winter Associates now. We've done some modeling on the building stock in Montgomery County, making sure that there's technical feasibility in the approach that we'll propose before and during the regulatory process. So yes, we have a general sense of where these buildings fall, but we aren't, I don't think that we're in a position to share that right now, but we are looking forward in our future work sessions to share that, but we'll make note that that's an interest.
Yeah.
That's all informed. Sorry, that's all informed from benchmarking data. So for buildings that have already been benchmarking for several years, we have their historical energy use, and that's, again, informing some of those regulations for how we set this, so it's achievable and reasonable.
The other thing I would add is that where you fall on this trajectory depends on what that final standard is. If the final standard is very tight, then more buildings are going to have to do things. If the final standard is less tight, then many buildings won't have to do anything. So I don't think we're going to be able to answer that question fully until we talk about the different levels of the final target.
Well, then, so is it fair to say that the age or the date a building was created, there's a strong correlation between where they would fit in this graph and as to when they were built, right? The older a building is, the more work presumably it would need?
Not necessarily.
Yeah, Emily's got some good benchmarking data that debunks that myth.
Okay, well, and a lot of this conversation is about debunking myths, right? And providing information as clearly as possible. And so as we have future work sessions on this, I think that's going to become important because, last thing I'll just say at this point in time, again, recognizing I think there is universal understanding that we need to do something. There is some concern about how, understandably, how we do it, but because of the I'm trying to think of the terminology that it used. The non-prescriptive approach, right? The regulatory approach that will be set.
Performance path.
Say that one more time.
The performance pathway.
Performance pathway, right? So, because people and businesses and building owners are not quite sure what that performance pathway is, it is creating some unease right now. And so the more information that we have that would help guide or unnerve some of those individuals, I think the better we will be. So I look forward to receiving that information, as much of it as we can, so that we understand the pathway forward.
Councilmember Glass, can I make a couple points in response to what you said there?
Sure, please.
So I think Director Ortiz talked earlier about the importance of setting the framework for establishing the final standards. Adopting this law will do a couple things. One, as Ms. Shaw pointed out, it will let building owners know that we're going to focus on building energy performance going forward. So when you do have this opportunity to retrofit a building system, which all these buildings are inevitably going to have to do through time, make sure you're making the more efficient choice. That's going to help you. And we want to, so the earlier we can adopt this legislation, the building owners have that information before them, knowing that they want to adopt a more efficient choice. Now, what the standard ultimately ends up being, that's, as Director Ortiz talked about, we're going to come back with that. And that's where we'll have more conversation about what's the effect of the pandemic on buildings in the county, for example. How does that affect energy use? We'll have more information. We'll be able to show you more details about, like this slide, about how many buildings we think we're going to be on the path that they have to do a lot, or path that they're going to meet a standard. So I think adopting the law, and I would say, especially if we can get buildings to start to benchmark, that's going to help everybody understand where they are. Because part of our problem is we don't have data on many of these buildings. So at least adopting a benchmarking portion of this would be helpful for the building owners as well as for the county in establishing the standard, but also setting that expectation that we're going to do something. And as we get into this target setting, we'll have a lot more information and have a much more robust discussion about where that target should be set.
I think everything that you said is correct and makes sense. And everything that I had said prior makes sense as well. And it's caught in this cycle, right? Mm-hmm. That the bill will help guide what changes are needed. But right now they're unsure about what changes are needed, which is what's creating some of the anxiety. Sure. And so again, my hope is that we can provide as much information and debunking of myths, whether they're from me, my colleagues, or others in the community or the industry, so that we all have better vision as to how to move forward. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, Stan, about the importance of benchmarking. You remember I had a benchmarking expansion bill in 2019 ready to be introduced, but DEP asked me to not introduce it and to wait for this bill, which we only got a few months ago. I think in hindsight now, that was pre-COVID and before the recession, I think it would have in hindsight been much wiser to expand our benchmarking back in 2019 in the middle of an economic expansion, despite all the job loss we had in Montgomery County at that time, to build more trust in the affected industry sectors and build more momentum and gather more data, given that now we have a very big ambitious bill that has been introduced in the middle of a recession and created a lot of concern in the community. So, yes, I think it would have been good to have the benchmarking in place a while back.
Yeah, with all due respect, the history of that is a little different from my perspective, but
the history of whether that would have been a good move in hindsight in 2019?
No, but we don't need to get into it. But I think we're very supportive of the benchmarking bill in 19.
Okay. When do we expect the winter report?
So we're in the process of finalizing that now. I will tell you that it is a significant level of detail and quite a lot of information in there. We want to make sure that we get it right. I think that we had originally said that we were going to have that ready in summer of 2021, and that has since been pushed back to fall. I think that it just goes to show that this is not a straightforward bill. We want to make sure that we are being thoughtful in what this information means to buildings in Montgomery County and make sure that we're presenting the information clearly and correctly to move forward. We have nothing but respect for the Stephen Winter Associates team. They've been fantastic to work with. They have such knowledge about building science and building operations and how performance standards moving forward will really be an impactful policy. But we want to make sure that we're analyzing kind of all facets of the policy moving forward. So we're still in the process of finalizing that report, which will inform the regulations that we plan on putting forward.
Right, and that will, can you describe the scope of it? I know we've talked about it. I'm not sure if everybody here knows, or certainly the public understands what the report is. Sure.
So the report is, it's a pretty broad look at buildings in Montgomery County. We've asked Stephen Winter to look at specifically getting a lay of the land of modeling our current building inventory, what those buildings are, how they're using energy, what they're capable of doing, just a good landscape on that. And then what's the technical feasibility of applying a performance standard and moving forward at a data-driven approach here on, based on the current building science, what do we think building owners can actually do for their buildings? And what do we think, comparing a couple different scenarios of, to Mr. Edwards' point earlier, the aggressiveness of the standard, are we asking building owners to do something that's maybe a little bit more straightforward to do, or are we asking them to really look at electrifying their buildings? And considering we have a target that's longer range, what might that mean in terms of our emissions? Will we actually get where we want to go with this type of building standard? I invite Emily or Stan to chime in on other things that this report is getting into. But we did do, to add on to that, some detailed case studies of actually applying some of this modeling work to actual buildings in Montgomery County, working with building owners and reaching out to them, and then also doing a cost-benefit analysis of what will it take for those building owners to upgrade their current systems, and would they be able to meet, a variety of different theoretical targets moving forward.
I think one of the things the study will highlight is the issue that Councilmember Reamer raised earlier, is that decarbonizing the grid is the critical part of this. These two things go hand in hand, and the report delves into that a little bit.
Okay. So I know I'll get calls about this. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to sort of explain on the front end. The report sounds like a great tool. Conducting that modeling, mapping our building landscape, figuring out how our current building stock uses energy and what they're capable of doing, and what the technical feasibility that you mentioned twice is that's available to us. That all sounds critical. I'm sure there are people watching who will say, and I've heard them say, aren't all those things that you need before you write a bill like this and expect us to pass it? Why are we asked to pass a bill like that without knowing how our current stock is using energy and what the results of the modeling is and what the cost-benefit analysis is?
So we're hopeful that going through this discussion of this legislation, that we get some guidance from the council. We'll get guidance from the county executive. Obviously, we hope to get some guidance from the council on what you would like to see with regard to the regulation itself. So again, passing this legislation doesn't establish a building energy performance standard that a building has to meet. That's done in regulation. And we could come back, the council could adopt a regulation that sets a very lenient standard. And the impact on a building would be almost nothing but benchmarking.
Right.
In most cases. So again, the passing the law gives us the ability to start the regulatory process.
Yes.
And sends the signal that we're going to be focusing on building energy performance.
Right.
The buildings will be required to benchmark, which is fundamental. No matter how we go forward here, getting a benchmarking law in place so that more buildings are benchmarking is important, because that's going to be the foundation for any building policy. It also, again, sends the signal to buildings that when you're doing those improvements, go for the more efficient measure. But then we'll have the discussion again about, or for the first time really, when we talk about regulations, about how stringent that standard should be and the trade-off between the impact on building owners and the cost to building owners, but also the benefits to building owners from having a more efficient building and the greenhouse gas reductions that we're trying to achieve.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. Yes, just to clarify that this bill is largely enabling. It lets you put in a regulatory framework to work with our affected communities and the regulated communities to make these improvements. And I think I'm freelancing here, but I think there's a messaging challenge. I think on the one hand, I've heard about us being the first county. I've heard about how groundbreaking this is and landmark and all those sort of adjectives. And I think you all are trying to say to the environmental community, this is a really big, really important bill. And at the same time, say to the building owners, don't worry, this is a very modest bill and we're going to work with you. And there's one audience, there's just one county. And that's why I think, like, when you call it a compliance strategy here, you're right. The green line that represents high performance buildings like the ones owned by Tower right now or Duffy right now, that just need to replace their already energy efficient windows on schedule every 50 years or something, right? There's not much to talk about. The other buildings that need minimal investment in the yellow line, not that much to talk about. The hard part are the buildings that are either older, to Ms. Shaw's earlier point, just energy efficient, old or new, energy inefficient, big carbon users, old or new, that need a big investment, and the owner doesn't have the capital to make a big investment. And hopefully we can find some financing so that they have an attractive ROI, right? But calling all that, lumping all of that in compliance, some of it's compliance, some of it is sort of like it's a combination of sort of waivers and extensions to get to a compliance over a very long timeline, right?
Yeah. So I want to go back to what you said about sending a different message we're sending the same message to everybody.
Okay.
That climate change is a difficult issue to deal with. Buildings are a key part of that. We collectively all have to make the decision on the stringency of the standard, which is going to put more requirements on building owners. And that will put a responsibility on the county to come up with tools, financing for particular sectors that can't afford to do those improvements.
Right.
And our climate goals. Those things, those are two tough things to measure, and communities all over the country are struggling with that. There was an article in the Post this morning about Los Angeles that struggled to get to their goal of clean energy by 2035. Mm-hmm. So we're not trying to send a different message to different audiences. We've been very upfront.
Good.
We do the same presentation with every audience, and the message we always send is, the real key here is when we go to adopt the target at the end, how strong are we going to make that target from a greenhouse gas standpoint? And the stronger we make that target, the more buildings are going to have to do something. And that's going to vary across buildings, of course, but that's the reality of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, good.
Our climate goals takes a lot of work across all sectors.
I think that's a good way to say it. Thank you. Good. Okay, sorry, Ms. Shaw. I think this was a long interruption of you.
Oh, no.
Councilmember Reamer, did you have any, I forgot, we finished that section. Did you have any questions at this point, or should we move on to the?
I don't have any questions. I just want to say very, very briefly, one of the things that I learned in reading about electrification from the national level is a premise of it is the federal government making very low cost financing available for all kinds of sectors to make big investments to transition to electric. And I think you said this, and I imagine we'll get to it at some point in our committee's process here, but I think it will be very helpful for us to talk about what tools we have and how we can make this affordable. Because again, I think the national framework isn't just you drop the regulatory hammer and everybody does, follows the edict and we transition to a clean economy. It's the government makes it possible to be affordable. And there actually isn't, there's no free lunch here, but it's kind of a collective bearing of that burden through financing. And I will say, we have seen over this pandemic that when the government wants to do really, really big things that are really expensive, it can do them. Unfortunately, there isn't really the public will to do that on climate at this day. But, you know, I'm eager to see what we'll be able to offer to facilitate the transition and make this affordable, because it can be, you know, this can be affordable. This does not have to be a zero-sum game where we're asking, you know, the private sector to bear all the costs for a public good. And let's find out, you know, more about that as we go. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
So I'm going to turn the presentation over for the next few slides over to Emily Curley, who's going to talk about building coverage, which buildings are covered under Bill 1621.
Lindsay, you can go to the next slide. We're going to do this. So as you're aware, buildings that are currently covered by the benchmarking law are non-residential buildings, 50,000 square feet and greater. Those are represented by the green bars on your chart. So currently we have about 110 million square feet and 800 buildings covered by the benchmarking law. That's about 40% of the county's total commercial floor area. So our amendments would drop the floor from 50,000 to 25,000 square feet, which you can see in the blue bars adds a little bit of area on offices, retails, cultural and institutional facilities. But the really big addition is in multifamily, that large blue bar on the left. So making these amendments would roughly double our building coverage to about 220 million square feet, just around 1,900 buildings, and cover 80% of the commercial floor area in the county. Now on the multifamily bar, I did also break that out by multifamily sector. So you can see market rate is you know, the largest share of that. But there's also a significant number of naturally occurring affordable housing properties. In this case, those are defined at 50% of area media income as affordable at that level, and then regulated affordable properties at the bottom. So those are subject to one or more controlling regulatory programs, or have a substantial share of moderately priced dwelling units within those properties. Next slide. So a quick look across different jurisdictions to compare our building coverage. As far as square footage threshold, we fall generally in the middle of what others have proposed. So in Washington, D.C., they'll eventually be phasing down to 10,000 square feet. You can see Washington State and St. Louis are sticking with the 50,000 square feet. And we feel that we're at a good spot with 25,000 square feet as far as the number of buildings that would have to comply, and the relative amount of square footage and thus energy use we get from those. So that's where we landed there.
Can you elaborate on that, Ms. Curley? Sorry to interrupt, but it just came up yesterday with the Bethesda Chamber of Commerce that Ms. Shaw and I were at. And you said while going down to 10,000 had been discussed in the county, and you and I have discussed it in the past, essentially yesterday I thought the point was the juice wasn't worth the squeeze to go down to 10,000.
Exactly.
So why is that? This is a lot of buildings, and they use a lot of carbon, don't they?
Yes, but in terms of level of effort, we were looking at something on the order of 900 buildings to get an additional 14 million square feet. So, you know, if you looked at, for instance, the last slide, you know, just warehouses, you know, and 95 buildings account for, well, not warehouses, that's less than 14 million, but cultural, institutional, you know, we're getting kind of that same square footage with a quarter of the buildings. So just in terms of effort, we also find that smaller buildings tend to be a little bit less sophisticated in terms of their energy management. You know, benchmarking can be quite a lift for them. So not to say that we would never, you know, fold them in, but at least to start with, you know, starting with 25,000. And again, those would phase in later. Those larger buildings would start first and then eventually phase down to 25,000.
So I just want to be clear, that makes sense, but is the issue that you don't want to put this just burden of reporting on a greater number of people if it doesn't produce that much potential savings later, or is it more work for the department that you're concerned about?
Well, it would be a significant amount of commitment that the county would make. We've talked about the sectors that are least equipped to handle this, so they need technical assistance. They might need financial assistance. This sector between 25,000 and 10,000 is going to have a higher percentage of properties that would need that. So it definitely will be more work for county, but it's also more resources, more commitment, and for the properties themselves. So our feeling is, let's start at 25, see how that goes. Then we can, as Ms. Curley said, we can expand later. But this is a good starting point. This is going to be a big lift for both the county and the regulated community. Let's start with a population that's a little better equipped to handle it.
Okay, that's a good answer. And can we? You're going to get back to this, Ms. Curley, but can we make sure you're clear? Here's the concern I hear from building owners, and I do my best to answer it, but I can continue to hear because I don't think this message is out there. The county collects all this data now and has been collecting it for years. We haven't had a BEPS; we've just had a benchmarking policy in place. I spend a lot of money. I'm a building owner. I spend a lot of money gathering this data and sending it to the county. What do you do with it? Why do we have a better county? Because you forced me to do that.
Well, I would say that we are using the information. We do some analysis on that every year. And what we found is that buildings, just through benchmarking, those buildings that have consistently benchmarked tend to save on the order of about 2% a year. That doesn't sound like a lot, but in a building that spends $100,000, $1 million a year on energy, just through kind of better education, better visibility into those, that does make a difference. I think, collectively in the county, buildings that had continually benchmarked saved a total of $3 million over a course of 3 years. So, kind of at the macro level, that does make a difference. And, to our point about benchmarking being a foundational policy, I think we're fortunate that those larger buildings have had time to get comfortable with this. They have members on staff or, in their third-party contractors that are kind of benchmarking pros at this point. And, we're really now starting to build on that to start to find some of those deeper savings and help those buildings to, really harness that information to take the next step.
Yeah.
So how do you go back and communicate that to building owners who feel like I send this in and then I never hear anything and don't know why I'm doing it?
Yep. We also provide scorecards to benchmarkers. We've done that the past few years now. So to get some sense of how they're performing relative to other buildings like them in the county. We give them a snapshot of how they performed relative to last year within their building, and then also send information about incentive programs, about the Green Bank, and about how to start to take advantage of some of those programs. That's what my colleagues want to chime into.
Yeah, so there's 2 points I'd like to bring up. One, the benchmarking law doesn't only benefit the county. It does give that information to building owners. They're able to see trend data over time. We have anecdotal evidence of building owners saying, I wasn't a huge fan of this in the beginning, but I now have the data to make cases to upper management about why we need to make certain upgrades or different systems that would be helpful to certain buildings. So they're able to have that information and have a data-driven conversation about why they need to upgrade their buildings. So we're excited at the opportunity of buildings that are a smaller square footage having that same information and having that same information for a number of years before they're asked to do anything with it necessarily. And since we've had the benchmarking law in place for so many years, we've had good quality data. We also have the data verification requirement as part of our benchmarking law, which requires that building owners have a second person, a second set of eyes look at their data, so you don't have errors in data reporting, so that good data in, good data out. So we have good data coming to the county. Building owners are making good decisions based on data that is real and factual and not potentially skewed by a math error or entering incorrectly. So they're using that information, and then we're able to use good quality information that is informing our approach to the building energy performance standards. The second thing, the last thing I'll say here is that the utility companies in our area provide aggregated services. So they, in some way, shape, or form, whether it's in a spreadsheet or automatic tethering to the portfolio manager tool, it's easier for building owners who have a number of meters on site to get their building data and do something with it. So they're able to get that information, put it in a portfolio manager, track it over time, look for trends of spikes or where there might be energy waste in their building. So they're able to get that information from the utility company. So some building owners like to sit down with a stack of bills and type them all out, and that's great. Some building owners like to just have a plug and play from the utility companies, and our local utility companies make it relatively easy to get that information in an aggregated form. So they're not sitting there plugging away, punching numbers into a spreadsheet for days and days. Just a couple key points on that benchmarking improvements and
Right.
what we see from that policy.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to go back. I still have a blank on this. When I know we were supposed to get the winter report in the summer. When do we expect it?
Fall of 2021. It's
Fall
in
of 2021.
We are in the process of finalizing that report. So we're doing rounds of edits. We need to, of course, brief the county executive on what's in that report, and then, of course, we'll bring it to this work session when it's out in the public.
And that'll have the cost benefit analysis. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Go ahead. Sorry.
Is there more you wanted to cover on the slide, Emily?
Yeah, I guess just touching briefly on affordable housing and houses of worship. They tend to be included in other jurisdictions. We have proposed including both of those. In other jurisdictions, there are at times alternative compliance considerations, additional time to comply. So you can see St. Louis gives affordable housing 2 extra years, or dedicated funds for those building types. And the last thing I'll mention is agricultural use. That's not quite as relevant in New York City and Boston and Washington, but Washington State explicitly excludes agriculture. The state of Colorado, they have a fairly new policy, so they're not here. They exclude agriculture if more than 50% of a building is used for agricultural uses. We have included them. I think there was about 10 mostly equestrian buildings that fell into the agricultural use type. So anyway, just a quick highlight on that.
And also industrial uses tend to generally be excluded from BEPS policies. We do have some industrial use in Montgomery County. They're excluded from both benchmarking and BEPS, and the majority of other BEPS jurisdictions take the same approach to industrial uses.
Thanks.
Yeah. Just processing what you just said, Michelle. I just want to make clear, I'm sure my colleagues would agree with this. I think we want to see the winter report when you get it. You mentioned briefing the county executive and then coming to us. I mean, we paid for this report. We're eagerly anticipating what it has, and we want the whole report, not part of it. So and as quickly as possible. I think
the report will be made public for everyone.
Right.
Oh,
Okay,
I think that we would also like to provide, just to give you a quick snapshot, it's 186 pages right now. We want to make sure that we catch the report.
215 just for this work session. So I think we're used to that.
Yeah,
yes.
We will make the report publicly available for everyone to see and analyze.
Great. Okay, thanks.
All right. This is not something we've talked about a lot, but one nuance in the law is in the bill is updating the definition of a covered building. So currently, we define a covered building as a building or any group of buildings that have the same parcel or property identification number that collectively meet the square footage threshold. So in practice, what that means, we have an example on the bottom left here that any building sharing a parcel that collectively sum up to 50,000 square feet, those all have to report to benchmarking. So in this example, you can see the dorm is only 16,000 square feet. If the church is only 27,000 square feet, and the school is 66,000, but because they happen to share a parcel, they all have to report. So for Bill 1621, we're looking to amend that covered building definition to really make it more building based and less parcel dependent. So that a single building, as long as it can be individually metered and doesn't share common interior common areas with other buildings, those could begin to benchmark and report individually. So again, in this example, the school would obviously be covered. It's larger. The church would be covered, it's over 25,000 square feet, but this smaller dorm would not fall under the benchmarking or BEPS requirement. And we have a couple examples of what this looks like in practice. This was a surprisingly hard thing to wrap our head around. But if you want to go to the next slide, I can talk.
I just want to add some rationale behind this covered building definition. I think Emily couched it quite well. I will say that in implementing the benchmarking law, the concept of a collection of buildings on a tax parcel caused a lot of confusion in the covered community. We think that this change, while minor, will actually help support the implementation of BEPS, but also reduce confusion in building owners of like, I own this huge strip mall, but there's also a bank and a gas station on my property. I also have to benchmark their stuff because they share a parcel, even though it's different ownership structures. Created a lot of confusion with the primary big building owner and the smaller buildings that they had to report as well. Created a lot of confusion in the community. We have maps to help overcome that, but it just created a challenge that we didn't anticipate with the original definition. So we think that this new definition, while seemingly complicated, it actually makes the implementation of the building and implementation of a performance standard on a specific building much more straightforward for the building owner to understand and for us to communicate to those building owners.
It's also more equitable. Under the current definition, a building that's 10,000 square feet might have to benchmark, and the same 10,000 square foot building might not have to benchmark if it's on a different parcel configuration. So this makes things more consistent. It merely depends on the size of the building itself.
All right, so obviously we have a lot of flavors even within property types within the county, but here are some examples of multifamily buildings that would be covered and some of those that we believe would not under our new definition. So covered, some of these I think are probably pretty obvious. High-rise and mid-rise apartments and condos, obviously they share building systems and interior space. Garden apartments where single buildings with those shared systems or spaces that sum up to over 25,000 square feet, those would be covered. And then retirement homes, senior living facilities like that would also be categorized under multifamily and covered by the law. Things that would not be covered, townhomes that abut each other, but they don't share any energy systems or interior common area. Apartments that may share a tax parcel or a building parcel, but each individual structure is less than 25,000 square feet. And then on the bottom right, units that have no shared system, no shared interior space. So in this case, they might have separate heat pumps and separate systems. In that case, they also would be exempt from having to report. Okay, and then last example here, Lindsay mentioned that especially with retail, things tend to be especially complicated because there are many facilities sharing a tax parcel. So again, in our new definition, these individual tenants within strip malls, again, as long as they have separate systems, they have no shared interior space, and they're less than 25,000 square feet, those would not be covered. But the anchor tenant typically within the strip mall or the retail site would be covered. So in these examples, we have a grocery stores that would be covered. And again, that's the primary energy use on the site, and that's really the owner we want to get to make these upgrades. And I think that's it for building coverage, unless there's any questions.
Mr. Chair.
We can keep plugging forward with the performance metric discussion, but love to take comments on.
I know the chair
here. Sorry. Go. Who had a question next?
Sure. Yeah, it was me. And I know sometimes you have internet connection issues, so I'm glad you're back. So with regard to which types of buildings are in and out, the type that clearly is omitted from the presentation are single family homes. So can you discuss the thought process there?
That's a really good question, and one that we've have answered before to the community who've voiced those same concerns, so I'm glad that you brought it up. The Building Energy Performance Standard is structured with the commercial multifamily units in mind. The metric that's used, the platform that's used, the compliance mechanism for Class A violations for commercial buildings. Bill 1621 focuses on that sector. We think the law is designed specifically for that building type, which has different challenges and ways that they use energy different than residential homes. I think that to look at a performance requirement for single-family homes is something that we are very interested in exploring, but the way that Bill 1621 is written, again, the metrics used, the platform used, portfolio manager, is really intended for commercial and multifamily properties. We're going to talk about the performance metric in a second, if we want to continue on with this presentation. The site metric is different. The calculation of site UI can be done for single-family homes, but there are other platforms and easier to digest metrics that can be used for single-family homeowners. There's the home energy score or the HERS rating index that are a little bit more on a 1 to 10 scale. So it's a little bit more like a miles per gallon of your home as opposed to the actual per square footage performance of your building. The reporting mechanism may be different and the timing might be different for single-family homes, and it's definitely something that we want to look at because we realize that it makes up a big portion of our community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. We want to make sure that we get building energy performance standards right. We have a platform in which to build already with the benchmarking law. We believe adding in this performance standard is just enhancing an existing requirement in the county already. But for single-family homeowners, we have a law where building at the point of sale, energy and water information needs to be disclosed to the new seller or the new buyer from the seller. I think that that's a really great foundation to build on, but I think that there's more work that can be done with that. Right now, there's no mechanism for the county to collect that data. It's just a disclosure tool for the new buyer. I think that we need to approach that first before we even talk about a performance requirement for existing homes and new homes as well. So I think, yes, we are 100% on board with that approach, but Bill 1621 isn't the right framework in which to explore single-family home performance requirements.
Sure. So thank you for explaining that this is not the vehicle for that, right? And while it might all be residential, it is not the same. And even within the single-family homes, you have the existing housing stock. My house was built in the 40s, and then you have tear downs, and then you have fewer and fewer greenfield developments that are occurring, but they still are occurring in the northern parts of the county. And so while this bill doesn't help for that, some of the criticism I have heard is we need to focus on that and not focus on the multifamily, and which is why I'm asking. And just while it is not relevant for this bill, it is relevant to this conversation that
Absolutely.
We address that. And so is there legislation, or what are the requirements for single family homes, new or tear down, whatever they might be, to be energy efficient, aside from just the conveying of the utility bills, essentially?
Absolutely. So I will say for new construction, for tear down and rebuilds, and for the greenfield developments that are happening, all of those new construction residential units need to comply with the building code in Montgomery County. The energy code that we have is pretty strict, and I think that we're looking at alternative ways that we can employ the climate action plan in building code. It's a very efficient way to move forward on new construction and for the tear down and rebuilds. Existing buildings is one of those things that I think everyone's trying to get their hands around. There's some great work being done out in Oregon on labeling of residential homes, and there's been some talk at like the Realtor Association at the national level that they actually aren't opposed to those policies anymore. There's some really good work being done out there that I think that we can tap into. I hate to say that it's a bandwidth issue, but we really do want to get BEPS right and make sure that we put this forward and start working on the regulations before we bite off more than we can chew, potentially have unintended consequences or undue burden on low and moderate income homeowners. We don't want to displace anybody. We, of course, don't want to create an affordable housing issue. But when we're talking about multifamily buildings, those properties tend to operate as commercial structures. So yes, they have tenants in them, but they do operate more like a commercial entity in Montgomery County. So they really do fit in this lane a little bit better. And I think that we need to build the road a little bit more concretely for exploring how we bring in single family homeowners. It's definitely an interest. We're talking about how the best way to get that done. And of course we have.
I see Mr. Edward real quick. I see Stan. I see you want to comment, but Ms. Shaw, I think the way you just framed the multifamily dwellings as essentially being commercial entities, right? They're business ventures. I think is a true way to think about them. They are housing clearly, but it's a business model. So okay.
I just wanted to add two thoughts quickly. One, there is a simple reality of numbers. We're talking about several thousand buildings under BEPS versus hundreds of thousands with a single family policy. But I also want to emphasize that equity, we're very cognizant of equity. And the way we want to address it on the multifamily side is make sure that we can provide properties that don't have the technical experience, don't have the financial resources to meet BEPS, to make sure they can do it. Because we want these buildings to benefit from the lower costs of energy efficiency and principally the air quality, indoor air quality associated with getting rid of fossil fuel systems in these buildings. And so we understand that this issue has been raised in a lot of different venues. We appreciate you asking the question. And we really understand the equity issues here. And that's where we want to work together to try to make sure we're addressing equity when it comes to multifamily buildings, particularly the affordable housing market and the naturally occurring affordable housing.
And the last...
Understood. I appreciate that. So I'm good with this, and I'll yield back to the chair.
Can I just make one final point on that? Sure. When we're talking about single-family homeowners, we're also talking about a brand new slate of stakeholders. And you know DEP and our stakeholder groups, we want to get people together. We want to talk to them early, often. And this is a brand new set of folks that we'd be bringing to the table. We've been meeting with stakeholders on Bill 1621 since mid-2019. So we want to make sure that we lay the foundation for a successful policy moving forward, not just throw something together to meet a need, but that we do it well and thoughtfully to Stan's equity point, but also making sure that we have the right people at the table. The folks who came to the table for Bill 1621 are not the same people that we would bring to the table for a single family homeowner approach.
Right, and I'll just close by saying I'm not suggesting that they need to be done in tandem, right? Because we have to do something. But the elephant in the room is that the single family homes are left out of this. It has been mentioned, I think, probably to all of us, as you noted. And so recognizing that, figuring out why, or having to explain why they're not part of this, and then what other structures either we already have in place or we need to put in place to make those single family homes energy efficient as well is important for this broader conversation. So I appreciate this dialogue.
Great. Thank you for bringing it up.
I yield back.
Thank you all. It's 11 o'clock. We kind of have to move on. I'm just getting a message. DOT's been waiting patiently. All right, so we're going to have many more work sessions on this. We'll probably continue to send you questions in between, and appreciate all your hard work. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Dr. Orland, welcome.
Well, what are your druthers in terms of which do you want to cover and how much time do you have? Can I just add the most critical one actually is item 2. WMATA needs 2 months to basically change the meters and the fare collection machinery within Ride-On. If you were able to act today and the council were able to act next Tuesday, that would be exactly 2 months before the January 2nd turnover of whatever the new fares would be. If you don't think you have time to do this today, I think we checked with Ms. Singleton. There is a teeny meeting next Thursday morning.
Right.
I have one item already there, but if you could add this to that, if we can't do it today, there still may be enough time to be able for WMATA to do its work before January 2nd. And we can figure out the other two items when we can.
Yeah, it seems like DOT would prefer that we defer and be able to spend more time on this. Is that Director Conklin? Welcome. Dan.
Yeah, good morning. I think that's a wise decision. You have guests from an outside agency that I think it would be best to allow them to give their presentation. The implication of this, as Glenn said, is whether or not it starts on a particular date. But again, I don't think that particular date is magical if we end up not hitting that date. So I would recommend that you give this topic the time it deserves.
You mean the WMATA study?
The fair policy.
Fair policy.
Yeah, okay. Right. And it allows us to have more time for the WMATA thing today. Yes.
Yes,
right.
exactly.
We have these guests that I didn't realize were invited in. Okay. And WMATA's asked us to have the opportunity to brief the committee. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I will just say I'm, grateful for your work to get the fair equity study done. And I know Councilmember Glass, Councilmember Reamer have been big supporters of this as well. And we're looking forward to hearing a lot more. I think the fair holiday that we extended recently has been the right, policy, particularly in this extended recession that has dragged out much longer than we wanted. And now the fair equity study shows what we all, empirically, what we all, I think, knew intuitively, that that most of our riders are people of color, that half of our riders are making less than $30,000 a year. They are not doing well in an area with the high cost of living that we have, and they've been going to work and serving as our essential workers through this pandemic. And I think that ought to be recognized as well. There might be climate and other benefits to continuing the fair holiday, but I think the main thing is we are in a policy environment where we have capped rental increases. We are have just denied the increase to WSSC that they were seeking, and I think going back to the previous discussion of what we have control over, we have 100% control over our ride-on fares, and I understand the county executive wants to restore them to some extent. I don't think this is the right time. I personally would hope that we could extend the fair holiday through the remainder of the fiscal year to June 30th, and we can discuss it next week. But hopefully we can have a I don't think it's hard to have a cost estimate for that. And I think it's certainly the right thing to do, particularly that we have, given that we have, due to state law, most of our revenue is collected in a very regressive way, and this is a progressive way to spend it and provide a service to the people that need it the most in Montgomery County. So yeah, that's where I am. I don't know if any colleagues want to chime in, and then we can have a real discussion next week.
Given the time and the other sensitive natures and other guests that we have, I'm fine with deferring it. And I'm long on the record as saying this holiday should continue forever, so we can continue this conversation next week. Okay, great. All right. Well, it sounds like that's fine with all of you. You have more of your day back. Thank you for joining us and being patient. Hopefully you learned a lot about our climate policy. Okay. So now, Dr. Erlin, we can move on. I think we can, I want to get
Yeah, I think you wanted to do number 4 then, the WMATA briefing.
Yeah, I think we can, number 3 is not urgent, right? We're not going to lose any of the federal funding or anything. We can discuss that another time.
Yeah, we can discuss that next week. Yeah.
Yeah. And why don't we get to the WMATA briefing? Thank you all for joining us. Dr. Erlin.
Okay, let's turn right over to Sean Canan, who's the planning director for WMATA, and he's going to turn to Mark Phillips, who was the planning program manager of WMATA, who's going to share some slides.
Thank you, Glenn. Yeah, nice to see you. Nice to see everybody. Nice to be with you this afternoon. I think we're not at afternoon yet, so good morning. My name is Sean Canan. I'm the planning director at WMATA. And we're here to provide you with a progress update on what we call the Blue Orange Silver Corridor Capacity and Reliability Study. And we're doing this at this point in time prior to commencing our third round of engaging the public, stakeholders, and of course you elected officials. We certainly want to make sure that you have been brought back up to speed on this study, which began in 2019, before we're in your communities talking and gathering feedback again from your constituents. So the study began in 2019 before the pandemic to address multiple long-standing issues within the corridor, including reliability, crowding, equity, and other service issues. In a nutshell, trains in that corridor, if you're familiar with where the blue, orange, and silver run, they do run in 3 different jurisdictions. They have been crowded during the peak hours for more than a decade, largely through the capacity constraint of shunting 3 colored lines through the Roslyn Tunnel. In particular, the Orange Line trains were exceeding our target of 100 passengers per car over the entire decade, with some cars experiencing crowding north of 120 passengers per car. When we added Blue Line when we reduced Blue Line service in 2014 to accommodate the Silver Line, we saw passenger loads on the Blue Line exceed 115 to 130 persons per car. And in 2019, when ridership was creeping up on Metro before the pandemic hit, we were seeing loads again above our loading standards on Orange of 110 persons per car. So that's the situation we've been dealing with for a long time. And one of the issues, again, we're dealing with is what we call interlining, which is essentially multiple train colors sharing the same set of tracks. That created lots of performance issues with respect to reliability and on-time performance. It meant that if you have a problem on one colored line, if something happened that delayed a train on blue, that would impact silver and orange as well. So we'd have these cascading impacts that would reverberate through the system. Interestingly, on-time performance on that corridor was regularly 15 to 25% below our system average, despite the gains we were making elsewhere. So I do want to note for the group, I'm aware of where we are at this moment in time. These issues did exist before the pandemic, and I don't want to pretend that I have a crystal ball and know what the super long-term effects of the pandemic will be on transit ridership. So while that's not clear, every piece of data we do have, I make decisions based on data, do suggest that we will continue to see longer-term growth and development that will increase both the magnitude and the extent of the overcrowding and reliability problems. And so it's my responsibility as a steward of planning at the nation's transit company to be prepared for that eventuality. So we do know there's a bottleneck, and we can either live with it for the next 50 plus years, or we can try to get in front of that problem by identifying and developing a project so it could be in place before that problem emerges again. And so this study, what this study is about, is designed to identify a solution to that and the other problems. And I want to be super clear about that because the fact of the matter is that this study helps the agency and the region come to a decision point. It is not a commitment to build anything. It is not a commitment to do anything. It is to resolve what has been a decade or more of multiple ideas tossed at the problem with no idea agreed upon as what the agency will in fact do if it chooses to address that problem. And these solutions, some of them may be short-term, but some of them take 10 to 20 years to deliver. Your own experience in Maryland with the Purple Line or our experience in delivering the Silver Line, that was a 40-year gestation period. So this study is the first step in a long process. We are following federal guidelines for this to ensure that should a decision be agreed upon by the WMATA board and the region, that we would in fact be eligible to seek competitive grant funding, and would enable the region to in fact compete with that funding. So I want to just reiterate one more point, and please excuse me double clicking on this. We are not recommending any one particular solution. Nothing in this presentation should be taken or construed as a recommendation. What this is an update on where the project is so that we can continue to be in your communities and gather feedback from your constituents. And so with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Mark Phillips, who is the project lead here, and will walk you through the details of this project. And I want to thank you again for making time in a very busy morning to hear this information. We hope you find this informative. Mark?
Thank you.
Thank you, Sham, and thank you, council members. Please let me know, by the way, if you don't see my slides or if you don't see them advancing. I was here at the beginning of the meeting, so I know the time is a critical need right now that we're pushing towards the end of the agenda. So I will run through these slides as fast as possible and just leave it up to the question and answer session to see if there's any unanswered questions. As Sham mentioned, we did start this project in 2019 to address some longstanding and serious issues on the 3 lines, the blue, orange, and silver lines. These are corridor-wide problems that require a corridor-wide or corridor-based solution. And we have actually been doing a lot of work in the background to identify alternatives and develop those alternatives with stakeholders in the public. But we are at the point now where we have to go back out for a 3rd round of public engagement. So we wanted to update and brief, give a progress update to all the elected officials in the compact area, as well as some of the elected boards. Sham, in his introduction, noted that these are, as we stated, existing conditions, or at least pre-pandemic existing problems that we've had for over a decade. We've had a lot of crowding on the 3 lines running through the Rawson Tunnel. And with the cooperative forecast from our jurisdictional partners, we fully expect that this corridor to grow to add 30 to 37% more people and jobs within 2 miles of those 3 lines over the next 20 years. And that increase in growth and development will increase transit ridership, and it will in turn increase both the severity and magnitude of the crowding, as well as its geographic extent, so how many stations and rail segments are impacted. Unfortunately, with our existing system, our technology in the tunnels, we're constrained in our capacity to provide enough service to meet that demand. We can operate 26 trains per hour per direction on any single set of tracks or tunnel. This means that, when we ran the 6-minute peak schedule before 2017, in order to do 6-minute service on the orange and silver, we had to cut back the blue service to 5 trains an hour every 12 minutes. And that created a lot of intense crowding on the blue line, as Sean mentioned. We have looked at our 8-car train program, but even 100% 8-car trains during peak hours helps, but doesn't solve the problem. So given our existing constraints, our physical capacity, and our technology, we cannot provide enough trains to meet that future demand or to reduce existing demand below our crowding thresholds. That interlining also creates significant problems for reliability. As Sean mentioned, our on-time performance on this corridor lagged the system-wide average by 15 to 20%. If there's a big issue or a surface disruption of one line, it impacts the other 2. Because our jurisdictional partners also successfully got us at dedicated capital funding, we're also going to have work zones along this corridor for the foreseeable future. And we want to look at options, not only to improve reliability in general, but specifically to better manage and navigate around those work zones and reduce the customer impacts of things like single tracking. Finally, we know that if Metro develops or delivers any sort of large-scale project, it should further our own goals for sustainability and equity, as well as the regions. So this is things like encouraging or supporting mode shift, people switching from single occupancy vehicles to transit, as well as reducing our operational costs or increasing our fare box recovery ratio. It also means expanding access to high capacity transit and access to opportunities and jobs and other useful places, particularly in equity areas. So we worked with our stakeholder groups and the public to take those identified issues and turn them into goal statements. So these 4 goal statements drove the identification of potential options, as well as the narrowing of that full set of options down to the 6 alternatives that I'll present today. And they also should drive the decision or the focus on selecting that preferred solution. As Sham also mentioned, we know that this is likely to require a relatively large-scale investment, and that the region and Metro would probably want to pursue federal funding to support it. With that in mind, we structured the Blue, Orange, and Silver study, to accord with federal guidelines for an alternatives analysis study. And we also like to show people and really drive home the point that this is just the very first step in a long project delivery timeline when it's oriented towards federal funding and federal process requirements. So we're looking at, a 10 to 20 year at least delivery window. This is just the first step. And there is no commitment between for WMATA or the region to build and deliver anything until there's a funding agreement between the region, WMATA, and the federal government. As I mentioned, we structured this study and the process to make sure that any project identified can compete for federal funding. So we had this 2-year process where we identified a set of options, those goals, narrowed it down to the set of alternatives we're talking about today. And now we're at the stage of moving from those 6 alternatives to the board, Metro's board of directors selecting that preferred solution or the locally preferred alternative. And before we can do that, we want to do these kind of engagement, these briefings to our jurisdictional partners, as well as then hire another round of stakeholder and public engagement. And if you look at this timeline, those 3 stars show major public engagement efforts. Just a high level note on that, the study does benefit from input from 4 different advisory committees, stakeholder groups that we meet with on a regular basis. That's 2 internal at WMATA and 2 external of jurisdictional partners, both policy makers and technical level staff. We also have a community-based and business-based organization work committee that we met with twice. And we had a lot of public engagement activities, including pop-ups, an online survey, and public meetings. All of that input gave us an initial universe of over 275 potential options or ideas for addressing those 4 goals. And we were able to narrow that down using those 4 goals and some additional analysis to 16 project concepts, and further narrow those concepts down to 6 alternatives that we're showing today. This just wants to reiterate a 3rd time the note that nothing in this presentation is actually a recommendation for an LPA. Nothing should be taken in that way. The final solution or LPA could be one of these 6 alternatives, but it could also be a recombination of different parts from multiple alternatives. This slide just kind of shows you how the alternatives compare to each other in terms of in scale, cost, benefits, and impacts. Anytime you do a study like this, you start with the no-build scenario, so asking the question, can you actually attain your 4 goals using only the investments, the transportation projects the region and Metro has already committed to fund and build? So that includes things like Maryland's Purple Line, the Silver Line Phase 2, and Potomac Yard. Stepping up in terms of costs and benefits, we do have a lower capital cost alternative that tries to address most of the ridership and crowding issues with a large enhanced bus network, as well as some changes, expansions of our core stations, and looking at capacity on the rail cars themselves. And then finally, we do have the final 4 options are extensions and realignments of Metrorail lines. This map just shows you the no build. It shows, if you can see it, it's a little bit faint, but the purple line is on there as well as the Silver Line Phase 2. And we'd just like to notify everyone that our operating assumption by 2040 is a return to 6-minute headways. That's our baseline assumption. But I should note that if we do that without one of these other projects, that means the blue line is only operating every 12 minutes, which means we have intense crowding. This map shows you some options on the lower capital cost alternative, which is an array of multiple project components. So most of it's driven by an enhanced bus network or a blue, orange, silver bus network that's oriented around 6 bus rapid transit lines. I'm sorry, there's a siren in the background. 3 bus rapid transit lines between Northern Virginia and downtown DC, and 3 between Maryland and downtown DC, as well as 54 commuter routes and between all 3 jurisdictions. As I said, we're also looking at expansions of our core stations and dynamic scheduling of rail cars. And for our sustainability, our long-term viability, we're also assuming turn back to revenue service on either or silver or blue lines at West Falls Church and D&G Junction over the Anacostia River. The first of the Metrorail realignment potential options is taking the blue line and running it to a new Roslyn 2 station that has a direct pedestrian tunnel connection to the existing Roslyn station, and then having a new tunnel for the blue line, so separating it from the orange and silver through Georgetown along M Street, through downtown DC to Union Station, and then from Union Station, it would turn northeast, serving areas like Ivy City, the Port Town areas in Prince George's, as well as College Park and Greenbelt. And to avoid re-interlining, which is something we're trying our best to fix, we would assume that by the time it met up with the green and yellow lines of College Park and Greenbelt, that it would be on a separate track and stations. A second Metrorail realignment has the same corridor I just discussed from Roslyn 2 to Union Station, but from there it would turn south and try to serve areas of high growth and equity needs, such as the waterfront, Navy Yard, St. Elizabeth's, Buzzard Point in downtown DC, as well as National Harbor before crossing the Wilson Bridge to Alexandria. The third rail alternative builds a completely new and separate tunnel for the Silver Line at West Falls Church. So this completely separates silver from both orange and blue, It provides the highest new capacity crossing the Potomac River by completely separating that line. And it would give us the operational flexibility to either operate all express service in Virginia or a mix of local and express, because we would still have the connection if we wanted to use it between the silver and the orange. We would not take that away. And this one, once it hits the Roslyn 2 station, you'll notice that they all have the same corridor, the same alignment between Georgetown and Union Station for various reasons. And this one would also turn northeast to Ivy City, Port Townsend, Greenbelt. And finally, the last of the Metrorail realignments is another Silver Line realignment outside of the courthouse station to Roslyn 2. Would service M Street along Georgetown, through Georgetown to Union Station. And then this time it would turn northeast and serve Ivy City at Port Towns, but would travel to or connect to New Carrollton and its rail yard rather than heading to Greenbelt. So those are the 6 alternatives, as I mentioned, that we'll be taking to the public and having more stakeholder engagement on. And we will, as I mentioned, also be looking at what might be the performance be if we took different segments, like a different Western segment with an Eastern segment and kind of Frankenstein it that way. But before we get to that point, we also did complete a cost benefit analysis of these 6 alternatives compared to the no build. We have 14 performance measures that are all directly related to those 4 goals that I mentioned at the beginning. And when you score these alternatives based only on their performance on those measures in terms of benefits, that new Blue Line to National Harbor emerges as the most impactful, the most beneficial, and that Silver Line Express in Virginia, which is the completely separated tunnel, is the second most impactful. The lower capital cost alternative that really is driven by bus service, we believe it could meet the 4 goals. It has the fewest or the lowest level of additional benefits on top of that in terms of the performance measures. But when you factor in capital and operating costs on an annualized basis, the lower capital cost alternative becomes most cost effective, and the new Blue Line to National Harbor becomes the second most cost effective. And then the table below it provides you some metrics about how many new weekday trips each option would add to our system, as well as annual fare revenue, the capital costs, and the O&M costs. I just want to point out very quickly that one of the reasons the National Harbor Line scores so well is because it is serving areas already planned and targeted for development and growth, but also areas of high density and equity needs. So it does perform the best in terms of expanding access to high capacity transit and access to jobs for equity areas. The lower capital cost alternative, though it is most cost effective, I also have to point out that it would require our jurisdictional partners to invest pretty heavily on bus prioritization treatments on their corridors. And it's driven by the assumption that if we provide a certain amount of bus service that's attractive, that something like 3,000 peak hour riders will switch from rail to bus. We can't guarantee that outcome, but we can at least try to structure an alternative that might result in that. So that's a high level overview of the 6 alternatives and our cost benefit analysis so far. Just to mention the path forward, we're having more of these elected official briefings and boards. We're hoping to start the 3rd and final round of public engagement either in December or January, and supporting the Metro Board of Directors selection of a preferred solution, or LPA, in early to mid 2022. Thank you all. That's the end of the presentation. We're open to questions. Councilmember Glass, I don't know, it looked like you were speaking, but you might be on mute.
Councilmember Glass, did you have a question for us? You're good. Okay. Yeah, he may have been speaking to somebody else. Well, thanks to both of you. This is a lot to think about and a lot to take in, very thorough. How, just in general, going back to the beginning, how does the ridership on blue, orange, silver compare to the red line? I've been hearing about a lot of this, going back years, and then I separately always heard that the red line was the most crowded. So not to lose sight of our own backyard, how do the two corridors compare?
Yeah, just the distinction is the red line has historically been the most utilized in terms of total trips per day. Mm-hmm. However, this segment where blue, orange, and silver merge is the most crowded.
Okay.
Right. So in fact, there's like more More
fewer
physical
riders,
space.
more constraints would produce greater efficiencies in the system, if you could address those.
I want to say I agree with you, but I need to put that apart for a moment without actually saying yes. Okay. These are terms of art.
Right. Okay. It's very helpful. I don't know if there are any other questions. I know Councilmember Reamer had his camera off, but has been listening, so I didn't want you to think he wasn't here. But I know all of us have a hard stop at 11:30. So, Charlie, good to see you as well. Councilmember Glass.
Yeah, real quick. I'm recognizing the time. I just have two questions while you are here. If you could indulge us in an update with what's going on with the 7,000 line trains, first off, and then I have a second question after that.
Thank you, Councilmember Glass. As you may be aware, the current status is that entire issue is subject to an NTSB investigation, and we are parties to that investigation as such. Any information about that is the purview of the NTSB. We will communicate with them, and anything that we would choose to potentially contribute to the conversation would have to be transmitted to and then approved by the NTSB. So I know you appreciate our compliance with that level of rigor.
And then if I could add on to that, while we were meeting this morning, we did share with the public that we are continuing the current service levels across the system for the next 2 weeks. And we are working to get more of our 2K, 3K, and 6K cars added to our fleet for revenue service. So we're trying to ramp up the availability of additional rail cars in the system.
Understood. Clearly understand the ongoing investigation and the compliance with that process. But as Charlie, as you just mentioned, my interest in more is how to mitigate it, because not only is it a problem throughout the system, and we want to make sure that everybody is safe while riding the metro, but here in Montgomery County, we have a number of stations that are also closed, which has compounded the commute for thousands of our residents and workers here in Montgomery County. And how has WMATA and also, you know, in collaboration with the Montgomery County Department of Transportation, helped smooth that out as much as possible?
So we have been working with Montgomery County DOT and other jurisdictional transit agencies. Right now, what we've seen is that rail ridership is about 20 to 25% lower than it was, the week before we had to pull the 7Ks. It's been ticking up some this week. And again, our focus right now is on managing to the schedule that we're putting out there. On Monday, we were at 65% of trains within 2 minutes of schedule. Yesterday, we were at 70% of trains within 2 minutes of schedule. So we're really trying to use increased car availability to have some spare cars out there so we can have tripper trains, anything to address whatever happens. This morning, there was a deer strike near Tacoma on the red line. So, things like that happen. And so we're trying to make sure that we have at least some extra cars out there so we can have trains to address whatever comes up as you run the railroad.
Okay. Thank you for that update. And then just last question was referring to the presentation that you just provided and the various options for the blue line in specifically. And one of them that intrigued me was going from National Harbor over the Potomac. And that is because when the Woodrow Wilson Bridge was rebuilt, it accommodated for, or was built for, enabled to accommodate such a use. Can you remind us, as the conversations are taking place right now with the Governor Hogan's proposal to build a new bridge between Montgomery County and Fairfax, does that bridge have the same capacity for future need for Metro to utilize it?
So if I might just pull the threads apart for a moment, we are certainly participants in a variety of studies that are looking at additional mobility across what will eventually be the replacement for the Legion Bridge. I know there's a study that's being sponsored by VRPT. We have been stakeholders in the various efforts that are taking place in Maryland. My understanding from those studies is that they are still in exploratory phases, and certainly we will continue to provide options for consideration for Maryland that include transit. I think the other place you're referring to, Councilmember Glass, was the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, not the American Legion Bridge, which would cross over from National Harbor over towards Virginia. And so in that regard, certainly we are utilizing our knowledge that that bridge was designed to have some sort of rail capacity. And I believe, if not annually, but at least in the last 18 months, we did submit back to the state of Maryland an update of the previous work that had been done to look at capacity to deliver train service across that bridge. All of which is to say, we are collaborating on one effort and leveraging the other as best we can.
Okay, well, and yes, I was specifically referencing the blue line going from National Harbor over to Virginia, and that was part of the presentation you presented. And my question was more specifically about what future accommodations might be made for essentially what I would argue should be the purple line moving from Maryland over through Virginia to accommodate future growth in that corridor, and whether or not the rebuilt American Legion Bridge could accommodate that. And my understanding is that that is not part of the plan right now. I hope that the governors of the two states reconsider that and work with Transurban to reconsider that. So hopefully future councils will be here getting a presentation from WMATA about how, either WMATA or the Purple Line or whatever entity might it be can accommodate future transit throughout the region on what I expect to be a newly built bridge. So I'm good. I just wanted to make that comment and ask for clarification. So I appreciate that. And Mr. Chair, I yield back to you.
Thank you, Councilmember Glass. Wasn't there also an option to extend the blue line to Bethesda and down to through Arlington to National Airport?
Or maybe we should just make sure we get purpose and need and the specificity that the federal process requires for the corridor. It's the right question, Mr. Hucker. Yeah, I'd love to learn more about that. I think that'd be very, appealing to Montgomery County residents for sure. Sure. I'll dive on it for a moment. Mark, you can let me know if there's more detail to add. One of the objectives here, of course, is to be eligible for or be in the running for potential federal funding. Sure. And the first two questions, of course, you have to answer explicitly is why, right? Why are you proposing this project? And the second question is what? So here in this study, we're trying to get to a point where we have a what, but discreetly, we have to adhere to resolving a problem that's been identified, and the project has to fulfill both the purpose and need of resolving that problem. And in this case, the problem that was identified was one at this, Roslyn choke point. So if that is the governing litmus test for what solutions advance because they most appropriately resolve the problem, the way that impacts the study is Mark is, I think in one of the slides you may have shown almost a spaghetti map of, we took in over 200 plus different ideas. And I want to give credit to your jurisdictions and being out with your stakeholders and your constituents, as well as the many jurisdictions from across the region. Whatever idea they threw at us, we ran it through all of the filters of resolving the transportation problem, the purpose, the goals and metrics of the study, the transportation modeling. And while many of these ideas stand on their own as promising ideas to explore and maybe potentially should be explored, the question for this particular study is, did they best resolve the problems in the blue-orange-silver corridor? And so that's the... Okay. That's the situation we're in. And I apologize. We're 10 minutes over and I got to jump in the car, but thank you all very much. I really appreciate the presentation. Thanks, everybody. Feel free to stay on, but I got to run. Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everybody.